Aliens gave Earth 9 months to survive. Australia sent 8 SASR operators. The signal came in at 06:14 on a Tuesday morning, and for the first 11 minutes, nobody on Earth believed it was real. I was eating a cold meat pie in a forward operating base outside Dili when Corporal Gary Nolan held up his cracked tablet and said, "Davo, you need to see this." He said it the way a man says something when he already knows the news is going to change everything, but doesn't want to be the one to put it into words. Gary was good at that. He had a talent for delivering information and then immediately making himself appear to be somewhere else in the room, as though the act of delivering bad news could be separated from the person who delivered it if the person moved quickly enough afterward. I looked at the screen. Every major broadcast channel on Earth had switched to the same feed simultaneously. That had never happened before. Not during wars, not during large-scale natural disasters, not during any event that had previously qualified as significant in the long and eventful history of human beings deciding that something was worth broadcasting. When every channel on the planet shows the same image at the same time, without a single network choosing to break from the consensus, something has gone very, very wrong with the world. And the something is not the kind of wrong that gets fixed with a statement from a government spokesperson. The image was of the sky above the equator. In the sky above the equator, there was a ship. Not a plane, not a satellite, not a weather balloon, or a classified military aircraft, or any of the comfortable categories that the human brain reaches for when it encounters something it cannot immediately sort. A ship, vast and dark and absolutely motionless, hanging in the upper atmosphere like someone had pressed pause on the laws of physics and then walked away without pressing play again. Its shape was difficult to describe, not because it was complicated, but because it seemed to present differently depending on the angle of the observer. From directly below, witnesses consistently reported it resembled a disc. From the side, others said it was more like a curved blade. The cameras that managed to hold a stable image showed something smooth and dark and unambiguously enormous, and then the feed would cut out, or the camera operator would stop filming and stand still with their mouth open, or the camera itself would develop a technical fault that nobody could explain and that always resolved itself once the camera was pointed at something else. It was approximately the size of the island of Tasmania, which is a strange and specific comparison to reach for when trying to convey the scale of something that had no business being where it was. But the human mind makes sense of unfamiliar scale by comparing it to familiar scale, and Tasmania was the comparison that appeared most consistently in the first wave of reporting, probably because Tasmania is large enough to be genuinely impressive and small enough that most people have a felt sense of what it means. For the first 11 minutes after the signal appeared, every government with satellite capability pointed at the upper atmosphere, treated the situation as a classified matter to be addressed through careful interagency consultation. Then the ship transmitted. It transmitted in every human language simultaneously, not rough approximations, not translations that carried the stilted quality of something produced by a machine that had learned the dictionary without learning the culture. Fluent, correct, perfectly accented versions of every language spoken on Earth, down to regional dialects and subdialects that most living linguists did not know existed as distinct categories. Whatever was inside that ship had been listening to us for a very long time, long enough to learn not just what we said, but how we said it, and where, and with what specific inflection, depending on whether the speaker was frightened or calm, or attempting to conceal the fact that they were either. The message was brief. We are the Veth. We have observed your civilization for 212 years. You have reached the threshold of development beyond which independent operation presents unacceptable risk. You will transfer governance of this planet to Veth Administrative Authority within 9 months from the date of this transmission. Non-compliance will result in surface sterilization. This process has been completed on 14 previous occasions. It is not a negotiation. It is a notification. You have 9 months. Then every channel switched back to regular programming. I remember that last detail clearly, because whatever program had been airing on Channel 7 before the broadcast resumed immediately, and it was an advertisement for a carpet cleaning service. The contrast between what had just been said and the advertisement that followed it was so absolute that Gary started laughing. He laughed for a sustained period. None of the rest of us joined in, but none of us told him to stop either, because the laughter was the only response available that did not require us to immediately decide what we believed about what had just happened and what we intended to do about it. 9 months. That was the number they had chosen. 9 months. As though they had run a calculation and determined that was the appropriate window for a species to conclude whatever small personal matters it had been attending to before the end arrived. Enough time, if you were organized about it, to have the conversations you had been postponing for years. Enough time to write the letters you had been meaning to write. Enough time, if you worked quickly, to plant a garden and watch something grow before the conditions for growing were removed. I sat on the edge of my bunk that night and thought about what 212 years of observation looked like from the other side of the arrangement. All the conversations that had been listened to from above, all the arguments and the laughter, and the songs people sing in their cars when they are certain no one is watching. All the ordinary human things that had been recorded and analyzed and filed. 212 years of us having no awareness that we were being studied. And at the end of all that patient, thorough study, the conclusion reached was that we were manageable. The kind of problem you notify rather than negotiate with. I finished my tea and went to sleep. It seemed like the most useful thing available to do. In the morning, the world was different. Not in the way that films suggest a world changes when something like this happens. There were no widespread disturbances in major cities. There were places where people gathered outdoors, but most of them simply stood close together and talked quietly, which was its own particular kind of frightening to observe. Silence and quiet speech are what humans reach for when words stop being adequate to the thing that needs to be addressed. The United Nations convened an emergency session that lasted 31 hours and produced no resolution. World leaders gave public addresses. Several of them cried on camera. One of them, a man I will not name because history will eventually account for him more accurately than I could, stood in front of his nation's flag and announced that compliance with the VETH notification was the only rational course available, and that his country intended to cooperate fully with the transition of governance. He was the first leader to say it publicly. He was not the last. The technical assessments came in from research institutions and intelligence services over the following week, and they were broadly consistent in their conclusions. The VETH ship was not susceptible to any conventional weapons system that had been discreetly tested against it. Nuclear options were immediately complicated by the position of the ship, which was close enough to the atmosphere that any detonation would produce consequences for the planet below that made the option practically worthless. Electromagnetic approaches had no observable effect. Whatever material composed the VETH hull absorbed, or redirected everything directed at it, with the indifference of stone absorbing a thrown piece of paper. The obvious approaches accomplished nothing. Which was precisely when the interesting conversations began. The VETH sent a second transmission 48 hours after the first, announcing that 6 monitoring vessels would be landing at specified equatorial coordinates to establish observation posts and begin measuring compliance rates across the major population centers. They described this as a courtesy measure. They wanted us to know the vessels were coming so that we would not misinterpret the arrival and take an action that would accelerate the timeline unnecessarily. That was the phrase they used. Accelerate the timeline. Everyone understood what it meant. Nobody in any official forum wanted to be the one to translate it plainly. The monitoring vessels landed exactly where specified and on the schedule indicated. They were smaller than the main vessel, by significant orders of magnitude, but smaller in the way that a car is smaller than a house, still large enough to be unmissable, still present in a way that reorganized the geography around them simply by being there. Nothing emerged from them for the first 3 days. They sat in their positions and conducted whatever operations they were conducting inside, and the nations around them established exclusion zones and disputed whether those zones represented sensible precaution or quiet capitulation, and nothing was agreed. On the 4th day, the doors opened. The VETH were insectoid. That was the word that every news organization converged on within seconds of the first images reaching broadcast, and it was accurate as far as it went, which was not all the way. They had 6 limbs. The lower 4 were used for locomotion, and the upper 2 for interaction with objects and environment. Their bodies were covered in something that had the appearance of a dense, segmented shell, suggesting that their structural support was external rather than internal. They were roughly 2 meters tall at full extension, though they typically maintained a forward-leaning posture that human observers consistently read as indicating aggressive intent. even when nothing else in the context supported that interpretation. Their heads were elongated, with two large eyes that did not catch and reflect light in the way that animal eyes do, and a cluster of sensory organs below the eyes whose function the analysts could not immediately determine. They moved in groups of 4. Always exactly 4. Nobody observing their movements ever recorded a group of 3 Veth or a group of 5. 4 was the operational unit that carried meaning for them, some combination of cultural and functional significance that the analysts had not fully decoded in the time available. They moved through the cleared spaces around their landing sites with a quality of complete indifference to what they were moving through that was more unsettling to human observers than open hostility would have been. Hostility at least involves acknowledging the other party's presence. These things looked at the cameras and the gathered crowds and the military cordons, the way that a person moving through a house they are familiar with looks at the furniture, noting without seeing, passing without pausing. They were not nervous. There was no indication they had ever been nervous, or needed to be, in the entire operational history that the intelligence analysts were rapidly trying to reconstruct. Why would they be nervous? They had done this 14 times. They knew exactly how it went. I watched the footage from the operations room in Dili, and felt something that I did not have an accurate name for at the time. It was not fear. I had been in enough difficult situations to know precisely what fear felt like in my body. The specific cool sensation that begins at the base of the skull and travels, the change in breathing, the sharpening of everything into heightened clarity. This was not that. This was something quieter and more methodical. It was the feeling of looking at a problem and recognizing that every obvious approach to it was going to produce nothing, which meant that the right approach was located somewhere outside the obvious, which meant that it existed, which meant that with sufficient thought, it could be found. I made myself a coffee and started thinking. 3 weeks after the initial transmission, I received orders to return to Australia. I had been expecting them. When situations become strange enough, at a certain level of strange, the SAS receives a phone call, because the SAS exists precisely for the space between what conventional military options can accomplish and what the situation actually requires. That space had just grown to a size that most people did not have a framework for imagining. I flew into Perth on a transport that carried the combined smell of jet fuel and institutional anxiety, and at the gate, a sergeant I did not know met me without introducing himself, and drove me 40 minutes to a facility that did not appear on any map I had been issued in my career. I was shown into a briefing room where 8 other people were already seated around a table. I recognized 3 of them. Gary Nolan was there, which should not have surprised me but did anyway, because Gary had a consistent and slightly uncanny quality of being present precisely at the moments when things were about to become significantly more complicated than they already were. Beside him sat Corporal Lena Webb, who was the finest signals operator I had encountered in the regiment, and who possessed the enviable ability to appear completely relaxed in any environment, including this one, which was the kind of environment that produces a fine persistent tension in most people. The third familiar face was Warrant Officer Pete Dawson, seated at the back of the room with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has already received the briefing and is now waiting to observe how others receive it. The remaining 5 were new to me. There was a compact man with close-cropped gray hair, who was introduced as Sergeant Vic Hale, and who had a quality of stillness that I immediately recognized as the particular stillness of someone who moves extremely quickly when movement is required. Beside him sat Corporal Anna Cole, who turned out to be a demolition specialist of such unusual competence that 2 separate governments had independently and quietly asked her to please cease publishing her technical research, which she had declined to do, on the grounds that knowledge that exists benefits from being shared. There was Dr. Owen Marsh, who was not military and had never been military, but who had spent 6 years decoding non-human communication systems for a research program that most of the people in the room had only heard rumors about, and that Owen himself described, when asked, as interesting. There was Sergeant Nick Ford, who held qualifications in more operational categories than I could count in a reasonable amount of time, and who ate a sandwich throughout the entire briefing, without once directing his eyes toward it, which suggested either extraordinary peripheral vision or the kind of habitual confidence in his own hands that comes from operating in conditions where looking away from your surroundings is not advisable. And there was Corporal Bex Hayward, who said nothing during the introductions, looked at every surface and corner of the room in a single systematic sweep, and had, by the time introductions were complete, already identified the two structural features of the building most relevant, if circumstances inside it changed rapidly. I found myself thinking well of all of them, within approximately 4 minutes, which in my experience is one of the more reliable early indicators that a team is going to be worth something when the situation demands it. Colonel Arthur Grimes entered at exactly the scheduled time, placed a folder on the table that he did not open at any point during the briefing, and said, "I am going to give you some information, and I want each of you to hold it for a moment before responding, because the instinct to respond immediately is going to take your thinking somewhere less useful than where it needs to go." He paused. The pause had clearly been practiced. "We have a recovered Veth scout vessel," he said. "It came down 7 days ago in the Northern Territory. The Veth have not publicly acknowledged the loss. Our technical teams have been working on it since recovery, and assess that they can make it operational within 3 weeks. Operational meaning capable of achieving lift and directed movement. The navigation and life support systems are still being analyzed." He allowed that to settle. "We are proposing to place a small team aboard that vessel, transit to the Veth Orbital Monitoring Station, which has been positionally confirmed at 1,400 kilometers above the equator, and conduct a direct action mission, whose objectives I will explain momentarily. I want to be transparent with you about the extraction plan, which is that we are still developing it." Nick Ford swallowed a portion of his sandwich. "Objectives," Pete said from the back of the room. It was not precisely a question. "First, intelligence," Grimes said. "We need to understand the architecture of the Veth communication system on that station. If there is a command hierarchy, we need to understand where it originates. Second, disruption. The monitoring station is coordinating the compliance assessment across the surface. Interrupting that coordination changes the information the fleet is receiving, and changed information produces different calculations. Third, and this is the one I want you to hold with care, demonstration. That we are not what they have classified us as being." "Why 8 people?" Lena asked. "Because the recovered vessel holds 9 occupants at maximum capacity," Grimes said, "and 1 seat is required for Dr. Marsh, and whatever equipment he determines is necessary." "What equipment is that?" Owen asked. "The equipment you are going to build over the next 3 weeks," Grimes said, "to decode whatever communication system is operating on that station." Owen looked at the ceiling for a measured moment. "What frequency ranges are we beginning from?" "Everything your team can extract from the transmissions we have collected to date," Grimes said. "That determination is part of what I need from you." Owen nodded and opened his notebook. That was how 8 people came to receive the most improbable operational assignment in the history of Australian defence, which is significant when you consider some of the assignments that have been given to Australian service personnel over the past century. I called my mother that evening from a line that was technically designated for operational use, but that everyone with access used briefly for personal calls when it mattered enough. I told her I was well, that I had received a new assignment, that she should not worry. She said she was not worrying. She said she had made a fruit cake and put half of it in the freezer for when I returned. I said that sounded good. She said it was good. She had eaten 2 slices herself as a quality check, and they had passed. I went to sleep thinking about that fruit cake, with a degree of specificity that surprised me. The following morning I began the process of learning to operate a vehicle that had not been manufactured on Earth. The recovered Veth scout vessel occupied a reinforced hangar under lighting that gave everything the slightly incorrect quality of a photograph taken with the wrong settings. It was roughly the size of a large transport truck, its surface smooth and dark in a way that absorbed light rather than returning it, which created a subtle difficulty in looking at it directly for extended periods, as though the eyes kept reaching for a reference point that the surface refused to provide. The interior had an ambient smell that combined ammonia with something else that nobody on the technical team had been able to identify conclusively, something faintly organic and sweet that Pete Dawson said reminded him of a tree he had encountered once in the western ranges of Queensland. Nobody else in the room could confirm or deny this comparison, but nobody could think of a reason to dispute it either. The controls had not been designed with human physiology in mind. The engineering team that had preceded us had identified the primary propulsion interface and installed a secondary control system alongside it using materials available in the facility, a system that was imprecise and required constant manual compensation, but that was functional in the way that an improvised tool is functional when no proper tool is available and the task needs doing. The secondary system responded approximately half a second after each input. I spent 3 days learning to work within that delay, by making decisions fractionally before the optimal moment to make them, which is not a natural way to operate, but which becomes possible once you commit fully to the idea that the environment is not going to accommodate you, and you are going to have to accommodate it. Lena spent the same 3 days extracting every transmission the vessel had sent and received since its recovery. The total was 0. Whether that was reassuring or not depended on your view of alien automated systems and what their silence under unusual circumstances might indicate, and the team distributed across both views, without anyone feeling the need to resolve the disagreement. Anna Cole spent her first 3 days doing what she consistently did with any unfamiliar technical system, determining precisely how it could be disassembled and at what points the disassembly would be most immediately consequential for the surrounding environment. She emerged from the engine section on the 3rd day with the expression I had learned to associate with the words, "I have found something worth knowing about." She assembled us around the technical schematic of the vessel's power system and indicated a unit located in the rear section. This generates more energy per operational cycle than the combined output of the Sydney metropolitan grid. For a scout ship, Gary said. Yes, Anna said. It is also structurally unstable if 3 specific shielding components are removed, and it is operated above 80% of rated capacity. Pete looked at her with a steady, measured attention. What kind of instability? The kind that presents a significant and immediate problem for anything within roughly 400 meters, Anna said. She said this in the same tone she said most things, which was calm and without particular emphasis, a quality that had the effect of making the content land with more weight than a more dramatic delivery would have produced. Good to know, I said. I thought so, Anna said, and returned to the engine section. Owen Marsh spent the first 3 days in a state of near-continuous working attention, sleeping briefly and eating whatever was placed near him, without apparent awareness of what it was, filling pages of notes in a hand that became less legible as exhaustion increased, but that he could apparently still read back without difficulty. On the 3rd evening he looked up from his materials and said, "The Veth language is not primarily audio-based. The audio component that we have been treating as the main language is closer to a grammatical framework, something like punctuation. The actual information is encoded in chemical signals, released at frequencies we can detect but that have not been analyzed, because the assumption was that audio carried the primary content. Can you decode it?" I asked. "I have decoded approximately 9%, Owen said. That is 9% more than anyone else currently working on the problem has managed. With 2 additional weeks, I could extend that significantly. We have 3 weeks before launch, I said. Then I will build what I can in the available time, Owen said. He said it without complaint or frustration, with the tone of someone who has assessed the constraints and already moved past them into the work. On the 14th day, Colonel Grimes assembled us in front of a large screen, showing a live image of the Veth orbital station. It was visible from the surface now with adequate optical equipment, an angular shape in low orbit emitting a faint rhythmic pulse of light that had been observed and catalogued without satisfactory explanation. "We launch in 4 days, Grimes said. The recovered vessel's transponder code has been isolated and replicated by the technical team. The station should register you as a returning scout for approximately 12 to 15 minutes before your approach vector generates an inconsistency flag. 12 minutes, Beck said from her position near the wall. 12 to 15, probably closer to 12. That is enough time, Beck said. She offered no elaboration. With Beck's, elaboration was generally not necessary. What are we carrying in? Vic asked. Whatever fits in standard kit bags, Grimes said. Metallic signatures will flag on any scanning system the station operates. 2 materials have been identified as transparent to the scanning frequencies we have detected. Equipment will be fabricated from those materials where possible. Where it is not possible, you adapt on site. Understood, Nick said. He had a sandwich, which he was working through without urgency. Grimes paused, and something moved across his face that he controlled quickly, but not completely, before it was visible. I want to be honest with you about one priority. The intelligence you return from that station has a value that exceeds every other element of this mission. If a choice must be made between recovering data and recovering personnel, data comes first. The room held that statement without objection or agreement. It was the kind of statement that honest people acknowledge by simply continuing to breathe, which everyone in the room did. One thing, I said. The Veth surface monitoring vessels have been sending reports to the station. Yes. Those reports describe us as frightened, disorganized, and likely to comply. That is the assessment that has been transmitted, Grimes confirmed. Then let us leave that assessment exactly where it is, I said, until we choose to change it. Grimes looked at me for a long moment. Agreed. That evening I wrote 3 letters. The first to my mother, sealed and given to Grimes with instructions applicable only under specific circumstances. The second to my brother in Brisbane, shorter, covering similar ground. The third addressed to no one specific, which I kept unsealed in my jacket pocket, because it was more useful as a personal reminder of what I was attempting and why, than as a communication directed anywhere particular. 4 days later, we launched. The air inside the vessel felt thinner than the instruments indicated it was. The ammonia component of the interior atmosphere did something to the brain's interpretation of breathable air, creating a persistent low-level sensation that the oxygen percentage was lower than Lena's monitor consistently showed. Pete Dawson adopted a specific breathing rhythm within the first 5 minutes and held it without variation throughout the ascent, a technique he said had been taught to him by a retired smoke diver he had trained alongside in Darwin many years earlier. I had seen Pete use this technique in 4 previous difficult environments, and it had never once produced a result he was unhappy with. I flew the vessel. The half-second lag in the secondary control interface meant that operating it smoothly required deciding a fraction of a second before the optimal moment, committing before full certainty was available. There is a kind of discipline in that, a willingness to accept that the environment will not wait for you to be ready. That readiness is something you carry with you rather than something the situation provides. The ascent took 23 minutes. I watched the atmosphere thin and clarify, and the shape of the planet below become something my eyes could process, but my mind kept needing additional time to fully accept, and I kept my attention on the instruments, because beauty is something you experience completely, only when you are safe enough to be distracted by it, and we were not going to be. Transponder is active, Lena said from her position in the rear section. Station is reading us, registered as Scout 9. Scout 9, Gary said quietly. That's a decent name. It's a decent name for another 10 minutes, Beck said. 9.5, Lena said, doing the calculation in her head as she spoke. The station grew in the forward viewport, from an angular shape at distance, into something that occupied the entire field of view, and then extended beyond it. I had studied the dimensional data until I could have recited it from memory, but data and direct visual experience of a thing are different in ways that matter. The station had clearly accumulated rather than been designed in its current form. Different sections showed variations in material and configuration that suggested construction and addition over a very long period, each expansion slightly different from what preceded it, the whole thing more like a settlement than a vessel. 6 docking positions visible on this approach face, Beck said. Station is directing us to position 4, Lena confirmed. Center of the row. Center gives more options for movement in multiple directions, Bex noted. She was already building her interior model. The station's systems took over the final approach with a smoothness, suggesting they had replaced my imprecise manual guidance with something they considered more appropriate. I kept my hands near the secondary interface anyway, which is a habit I see no reason to apologize for. We docked, the collar sealed. Pressure equalized. The hatch opened. The corridor beyond was wide and curved slightly downward, lit in a color between blue and gray that required about 30 seconds to fully adjust to. Gravity was lower than Earth standard, by a noticeable margin, which affected movement in small ways that required immediate and continuous recalibration. The floor vibrated at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing, present in the soles of the boots as a constant faint hum. Bex went first, then Vic. Then the rest of us in the order that had established itself through mutual understanding over the previous 2 weeks rather than through any explicit discussion. Lena monitored frequencies from the rear. Owen positioned himself where he could observe and work without impeding anyone else. 26 seconds after we stepped into the corridor, a Veth appeared at the far end of it. It stopped. We stopped. For the duration of one breath, we looked at each other across the length of the corridor, and I understood something in that moment that all the prior observation and footage and analysis had not fully conveyed. The Veth were absolutely certain, not arrogant. Certainty and arrogance are different qualities and should not be confused with each other. Arrogance is certainty that is being performed for an audience. What the Veth had was the private, internal variety, the certainty of something that has simply never encountered a reason to question itself. This individual looked at 8 humans standing in its corridor, processed the information present, and reached a conclusion. The conclusion was that this was an anomaly requiring categorization and reporting, not a situation requiring urgent physical response. That certainty was the first tool we used against them. Bex was already in motion before the Veth completed its assessment. What followed over the next 6 hours was the most unusual direct action operation I have participated in across a career spent in direct action operations on 4 continents. The Veth station was large, occupied, and equipped with security infrastructure sophisticated in the ways appropriate to the threats it had been designed to address. We were not the threat it had been designed to address. We were not the problem you design a security system around after 14 successful operations, in which every prior species either submitted formally or attacked in a predictable frontal pattern. We were the problem that emerges from people who have spent careers functioning effectively in environments that were actively working to remove them from existence, and who had absorbed in that process a set of operational approaches that do not appear in any threat model derived from the behavior of species that had not experienced that particular kind of extended pressure. The station's security systems were very effective at detecting large coordinated movements and massed approaches. They were considerably less effective against 8 individuals moving independently through a 3-dimensional structure, in ways that produced, as Lena identified from the communications traffic, and Owen translated with increasing confidence, an internal classification result that rendered approximately as, input does not correspond to any known pattern. Within the first 2 hours, Anna had located 3 significant junctions in the power distribution network. Nick had mapped more than half the section we had entered. Bex had identified 4 structural features worth knowing about in detail. Gary had established and tested a communications path back to the scout vessel, and I had located the corridor leading toward the center of the station, where the density of the signal traffic Owen was tracking indicated the primary command and communications functions were operating. Gary called in at 38 minutes. His voice had the specific quality of control he used when something had already registered as significant, and he had already processed it before reporting. Devo. Northwest section. You need to see something when you can. What kind of something? The kind that tells you what this is really about, Gary said, and the kind that tells you why we need to do this correctly. I worked toward his position over the following 16 minutes, moving through 2 sections of corridor that required approaches I would prefer not to specify in detail, and came through a hatch into the largest interior chamber I had encountered on the station. It was a display room. That was the closest human concept I had available for it. Every wall, from floor to a ceiling I could not accurately determine the height of, was covered in preserved artifacts, arranged in a system that was clearly deliberate and organized, grouped by origin with labels in the Veth language. 14 groupings. 14 species, each one represented by the objects and records they had left behind, each one processed through the Veth system and no longer operating as an independent civilization. Some of what I saw in those groupings was beautiful, in ways that required no translation or explanation. One section contained objects that were clearly musical instruments, slender and precisely constructed, built for limbs and sensory configurations I had no direct experience of, but that had clearly belonged to minds for which music mattered enough to build tools specifically for its production. Another section contained flat surfaces covered in arrangements of marks that had a compositional quality, an internal relationship that communicated intention, even across complete ignorance of what the specific content meant. A mind had looked at a surface and decided that the relationship between marks on it carried meaning worth recording. That decision needed no translation to be understood. I spent 4 minutes and some seconds in that room. Gary stood beside me and did not speak, because Gary understood when silence was what the situation called for. Then I documented everything. Every grouping. Every label that Owen would later translate across 6 careful hours. Every object and surface and evidence of minds that had existed and thought, and made things, and been incorporated into a collection before they had the chance to have the conversation that we were about to attempt to force into existence. If we were going to do the thing no prior species had done, the 14 who had come before us deserved to be part of why. I rejoined the operational flow and moved toward the center of the station. The communication hub was exactly where Owen's signal analysis predicted it would be, heavily accessed and centrally positioned, with traffic moving through it at rates indicating it handled not just internal station operations, but also the uplink to the Veth fleet and the coordination of the 6 monitoring vessels on the surface below. Getting there required navigating through the section of the station where the security response had concentrated, which Lena had been tracking for 90 minutes by the time we needed to move through it. "There is a window in the eastern approach corridor," she said, 17 seconds every 4 minutes where automated monitoring coverage drops below 60%. The Veth personnel are compensating manually, but the rotation has a consistent gap. I have confirmed the pattern across 5 complete cycles. "How consistent?" I asked. "Within 2 seconds in each direction," she said. "Every time." We used the window. I went through with Owen, Bex, and Vic. The others held their positions in the outer sections, which was not a passive role. Anna had been cataloging structural and technical features of the station since we boarded, and the catalog she had developed was becoming increasingly detailed in ways that were directly relevant to what came next. The hub was a large hexagonal chamber. 11 Veth were operating at workstations, arranged in a ring around a central display that Owen identified within 30 seconds as a real-time assessment of the compliance monitoring operation on the surface below. 8 minutes later, there were no Veth in the hub. I will not describe the specifics of those 8 minutes in detail. What I will say is that Bex's assessment of the room's layout, conducted in approximately 2 seconds in the entry hatch before we moved, was correct in every particular, and that Vic worked the eastern section with a precision that I have rarely seen equaled in any operational environment. Owen went directly to the central workstation and began. He worked for 19 minutes. The sounds he made were the sounds of someone working in a language not fully their own, finding words in the middle of a process rather than before it began. At 14 minutes, I have the fleet uplink. Active? I have been inside it for approximately 40 seconds, Owen said. The fleet is requesting a status update on the Earth compliance assessment. The station has been generating automated responses, indicating normal progress. The next automated response is scheduled to transmit in roughly 2 minutes. Can you intercept it? I can replace it, Owen said. Or I can do something with more scope. I thought about the display room, the instruments, the marks on flat surfaces. 14 minds that had made things worth keeping, kept in a collection by the people who had decided those minds were manageable. Send them us, I said. Everything we have collected since we came through that hatch. The security footage, the display room documentation, Owen's translation work, all of it. Send the entire fleet, everything that has happened in this station, in the hours since 8 people walked through that hatch. Owen processed this for 2 seconds. Then he started working with a different quality of speed. This will generate an immediate fleet response, he said as he worked. Yes, I said. They will know precisely where we are. They have known since the lockdown began, I said. The question is what their response is oriented toward. There is a difference between a fleet that is escalating toward a decision and a fleet that is escalating toward a question. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, sent. I called Anna. The 7 points you have cataloged. Yes, she said immediately. Dead man configuration. Can you do it? A brief, specific silence. The kind that means she is doing precise technical calculation rather than deciding. 90 seconds, she said. You have it. Devo. Yes. This is going to be interesting. It is, I said. Good, she said. I've been waiting. At 04:17 station time, The station's internal broadcast system activated. Owen translated in real time, his voice level and precise. "This is the station commander. The human unit currently inside this facility is requested to identify itself and state its operational objectives. A representative of Veth Oversight Authority is prepared to receive communication." Owen looked up from his equipment. "Requested," he said. "Not ordered. Not instructed. Requested." "Yes," I said. "That is a different word," Pete said over the comm from his position in the outer section. "It is," I said. "It means they want something we have. Which means for the first time since this situation began, there is something they need from us." I composed my response carefully, with Owen translating each sentence into the best vibrational approximation his 9% gave him access to. I told them who we were and what we were doing in their station. I told them about the display room and what we had found there, and what it meant to us, and why 14 civilizations of beings who had made instruments and art and meaning deserved to be more than items in a collection. I told them we were not going to have the exchange they expected, because Anna Cole had a dead man configuration active on 7 points in their power system, and we had a signal package cycling through their fleet uplink every 40 minutes, and we had the kind of patience that takes 30,000 years to build in a continent that never stopped trying to remove you from it, and we intended to remain exactly where we were for as long as the conversation required. 8 minutes of silence. Then the commander's response came through, and Owen translated it with the care of someone who wants to get it exactly right. "What manner of species are you?" I thought about the answer for a moment. I thought about the long version, and decided on the honest short version. "We are the people your category system did not have a classification for," I said. "We suggest you build one." The commander's response took 47 seconds. In all the communication traffic Owen had been analyzing since we boarded, standard Veth response latency was under 2 seconds. 47 was a different kind of silence. "Noted," Owen rendered it, after working through the translation carefully. "That will do," I said. The Veth fleet maintained its position above Earth for 11 days after our broadcast went through their uplink. 11 days is a substantial time to hold a position above a planet you have arrived at to administer. It is especially substantial when the reason for holding position is that you are attempting to solve an analytical problem that 2 centuries of preparation have not provided you with the tools to resolve. The fleet did not advance, and it did not withdraw. It remained in orbit and generated communication traffic that Lena tracked continuously, and that Owen translated in fragments, building a picture of what was happening among the ships above, even when the specific vocabulary of individual transmissions remained beyond his current reach. The picture that emerged was this. The Veth operated through a documented system that covered every stage of their expansion process. They had formal procedures for initial contact, monitoring, compliance assessment, and the outcome they called early resolution. They had detailed records from 14 prior operations and a classification framework that sorted encountered species into one of 4 behavioral categories, each category derived from observed patterns across those prior cases. Every species had fit one of those 4 categories. Every operation had proceeded according to the relevant category's documented pathway. We had generated what Owen identified from the internal fleet communication as the first Category 5 in recorded Veth operational history. He translated the relevant section and read it to us gathered in the hub. The Earth unit's behavior does not correspond to Category 1 through 4 behavioral profiles. Attempting to populate classification Category 5. Problem. Category 5 cannot be defined without operational data specific to the new category. Current operational data is insufficient to complete the classification. The unit has been active for 63 hours and has exhibited no behavior consistent with anticipated termination response. The unit does not appear to be attempting to preserve itself. It does not appear to be attempting to reach a negotiated compliance agreement. It appears to be operating as though it intends to continue operating indefinitely, which no unit of this size and configuration in this situation has previously demonstrated. "We do intend to continue indefinitely," Gary said. "Yes," Owen said. "That appears to be the problem." The situation inside the station had settled into a practical equilibrium. Veth personnel maintained operations in the outer sections. We held the communication hub and the 7 power distribution points Anna had configured. Neither side crossed into the other's operational space. This was not a peace. It was the practical outcome of neither party having a good option for rapidly changing the situation, and both parties having reasons to avoid forcing an outcome before they had assessed what a better one looked like. On the third day, the station commander requested a direct exchange. Setting it up required preparation. Communicating directly with a VETH commander meant working in a medium that combined audio with chemical output, and while we could not produce the chemical component, we could be present in it, and Owen could translate in both directions with enough accuracy for meaningful exchange, if both parties maintained the patience the process required. The commander was slightly below the average height I had observed in other VETH, and moved with a stillness that distinguished it before Owen had confirmed the authority markers in its chemical output. It stood on the other side of a door in the inner corridor near the hub, and I stood on my side, and Owen sat beside me with his equipment, and we talked. The commander's first substantive question was direct. What did we want? Not conditions for ending the current situation. What did we actually want as an outcome? The conversation you decided to skip when you arrived, I said, and held while Owen translated. The exchange you chose to replace with a notification, 47 seconds of processing. What exchange do you believe we bypassed? The one where you tell us what you are, and what you are actually seeking, I said. Not the administrative announcement, the genuine exchange between two parties who are unfamiliar with each other. Negotiation with species at your stage of development has historically not produced useful outcomes, the commander said through Owen. You have never negotiated with us, I said. You have conducted 14 prior operations and assumed our behavior would correspond to what you observed in those cases. That is knowledge about 14 other species. It is not knowledge about us. It is an assumption made without testing. A long pause. You are the first species to raise this objection, the commander said. We are the first species you encountered that was shaped by a continent full of things that were also attempting to end us, I said. We have been having this exact negotiation with our environment for 30,000 years. We have some experience with the form. Owen translated the commander's response with a small pause before delivering it. The closest equivalent I can render falls between acknowledged and I need more time with this. Take the time, I said. The commander took 2.5 days. During those days, the team maintained the work. Lena tracked the fleet communication for significant changes in volume or pattern. Anna maintained her 7 points with the attention of someone who finds the technical aspect of the work genuinely interesting, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. Nick Ford continued to produce food from his kit bag with a regularity and variety that I cannot rationally account for, and have stopped trying to explain. Bex had constructed a complete mental map of the station, and could direct anyone from any point to any other point, without reference to the partial schematic from the scout vessel. Gary organized a card game in the hub on the second day that 4 of us participated in, and that Owen joined with the complete and focused attention he brought to every new system he encountered. Pete Dawson moved slowly through the station on both days, looking at everything and touching nothing, constructing his internal model with the methodical patience that distinguished how he operated in any unfamiliar environment. On the morning of the second day, he found something. Northwest section, he said. The VETH patrol patterns are routing around it, not conspicuously, but consistently. None of them going in, not one. 5 complete patrol cycles. Everyone routes around the northwest section. Owen's assessment was that a communication node of sufficient priority would carry a dedicated security protocol, causing standard security personnel to route around it, rather than through it. The question was whether this node was relevant to our current situation. Pete led us there. The door was sealed with a mechanism requiring a VETH biological key, with no secondary interface. Anna examined it for 40 seconds. I can open it. There will be a sound. What kind of sound? Specific, she said. Not loud. We went through in 6 seconds. The room beyond was organized around a single central unit that was clearly the focal point of the space. Owen went to it immediately and worked in silence for 3 minutes before stopping and turning around. This is the direct command link, he said, above the fleet, above the monitoring coordination. This connects to the authority that issues operational authorizations for the expansion program, the level above the fleet commander. The room was quiet in the particular way it gets quiet when information has arrived that changes the shape of the situation. "Can you read what is on it?" I asked. "I have been reading it," Owen said. "The fleet has submitted a Priority 1 guidance request regarding our situation. The most recent response from the authority above, received approximately 14 hours ago, states, before any decision is taken, the authority requires a direct account from the station commander of the exchange that occurred on the third day of the current situation. It specifically requests what the human unit said." Pete looked across the room at me. "They want to know what you said." "They received a complete report about 8 people in their secure station," I said, "and their response was not an order. It was a question. They want to know what the conversation was." Owen completed his examination of the central unit. "I can transmit through this link directly to the authority, bypassing the fleet." "Send them a proposal," I said. "Not a demand. Not a threat. A proposal. The idea that there is a category of exchange they have never attempted with any species they have encountered, and that we are prepared to attempt it, and that the outcome would provide them with something more useful than anything their current process is producing." Owen worked for 31 minutes. He verified each concept against his reference materials, built the composite from everything he had accumulated over 3 weeks, and read the result back to me in English before transmitting. I suggested 2 adjustments. He incorporated them. We returned to the hub and waited. At 1943 station time on the 9th day, the response came through the Northwest link. Owen translated it and read it aloud. 3 sentences. "We have reviewed your submission and the supporting documentation. Your proposal for direct exchange rather than administrative notification represents a category of interaction not previously offered to or by a species in your situation. We are prepared to consider it. Maintain current position, pending arrival of an authority representative. Hold position, pending an arrival." The VETH authority above the fleet was sending someone, not to authorize an outcome, to talk. Nick Ford opened the small notebook he carried and wrote something in it, which seemed exactly right. Some moments deserve to be documented at the time, while the shape of them is still immediate. "What was the word they used?" Bex asked. "For what is going to happen when the representative arrives?" Owen checked his materials carefully before answering. "The closest translation I can render is an exchange of knowledge between parties who acknowledge mutual unknown." The hub was quiet. "Both sides acknowledging that they don't have the full picture," Gary said. "Yes," Owen said. "Both sides acknowledging it to the other." "First time," Pete said. "For them," Owen said. "I believe it is." The VETH authority representative arrived on the 4th day after the response came through the Northwest link, aboard a vessel that Lena identified 40 minutes before docking, and that was distinct from everything else in the fleet, in ways that extended beyond simple size difference. It moved with a quality of directed purpose that Bex noted was different from the administrative purpose visible in the movements of the monitoring vessels. It carried itself differently. The representative came aboard with 2 companions, not 4. The VETH always moved in groups of 4. 3 was the first deviation from that pattern anyone had recorded. Owen tracked it as significant from the first moment, and held his interpretation until he had enough chemical output data to be confident in it. The meeting was held in the communication hub, cleared of everything not operationally essential. The station commander attended at a formal remove, present as an observer in its own primary operations center, which struck me as the kind of situation the station's protocols had probably never previously needed to account for. The representative was old by VETH standards, Owen confirmed from the chemical output analysis. Old enough to have direct operational experience from before any of the 14 documented prior cases. This was not an administrator sent to manage an anomalous situation. This was someone who had been part of building the system that had produced the situation. It stood across the hub from me and spoke, and Owen translated with the careful precision he brought to everything that mattered. "I have been sent to understand," the representative said, "not to decide, not to authorize any outcome, to understand. That has not been the assigned function of this level of authority in any prior operation." "I know," I said. "Thank you for coming." "That is an unusual opening," it said. "It is what you say to someone who traveled a long distance to have a conversation," I said. "It is a fairly standard practice where we come from. 12 seconds of processing. Your proposal referenced a category of interaction our analysts found difficult to render accurately in our own language, the representative said. The phrase for two groups learning each other. Conversation, I said. Mutual exchange. The kind that happens between parties who do not already know what the other party is and want to find out. You believe this is more productive than our current process. Your current process has two outcomes, I said. Compliance or what you call early resolution. Those are the only two outcomes, because those are the only two that have ever occurred. I am proposing a third, one where you learn what we actually are, before deciding what to do with us, and where we learn what you actually are, and where the decisions that follow are based on real knowledge of both parties, rather than on a category model built from 14 species that were not us. What would you do with knowledge of what we are? The representative asked. The same thing you would do with knowledge of what we are, I said. Make better decisions. The representative was still for a long time. Owen tracked the chemical output afterward, and described it as the most complex pattern he had recorded from any individual Veth, suggesting deliberation at a depth that was, by any measure Owen could apply, exceptional. When it spoke again, Owen translated once quietly to himself, and then rendered it aloud. The 14 species in our records were processed, because our analysis determined each had reached a point of development, presenting instability risk to the operational environment. That analysis was derived from behavioral modeling, based on our own developmental history. We assumed the path from your current stage of development was consistent across species. It was not, I said. No, the representative said. When we observed your species, we identified the patterns we expected to find. We did not identify the patterns that were specific to your developmental history, because we were not searching for patterns unique to you. We were searching for patterns that corresponded to what we already understood. You saw what your model told you to look for, I said. Yes, the representative said. That is a significant analytical error. Yes, I said. It is. The silence that followed was different from any silence in the previous 2 weeks. It was not tactical. It was not a silence of positioning or assessment. It was the silence between two parties who were in the same conversation for the first time, rather than two parties in adjacent but different ones. Your unit, the representative said. The 8 here. They were designated by your government? We volunteered, I said. We were asked whether we were willing to participate. Every one of us said yes before the question was finished. Why? I thought about how to answer this with accuracy, and without excess. Because someone had to, I said. Because we assessed that we had a reasonable probability of doing something useful, and because we did not want to watch 14 become 15. The representative was still for 8 seconds. You came not to protect yourselves, but to prevent an outcome for your entire species, it said. Yes, I said. 8 people, the representative said. 8 seemed like enough to start with, I said. A long silence. We will need to conduct a formal review of the entire operational category under which Earth has been processed, the representative said. This review will require time. During the review period, all compliance deadlines are suspended. How long is the review? Unknown. The review is without precedent. We have not revised an operational category after contact was established in any prior case. We have time, I said. We have been here 9 days already. We can continue. The representative said something that Owen translated with greater care than usual, the care of someone who wants to render something, precisely because it is going to matter. The analysts above the fleet, when they reviewed your submitted documentation and proposal, used a phrase that I was asked to convey to you directly. It was considered relevant to what is happening here. What phrase? I said. Owen listened to the full chemical vibrational output of the statement before rendering it. He was quiet for a moment, then he looked up. The closest translation I can give you, he said carefully, is, we did not expect this kind of people. I let that sit for a moment. No, I said. I would not have expected you to. The representative departed the station on the morning of the 4th day of the talks, carrying a comprehensive record of everything that had been exchanged, and leaving behind a document that Owen confirmed had been created specifically for this situation, because no existing document type in VETH administrative records covered it. The document suspended all compliance deadlines pending the outcome of a review that the representative described as unprecedented in the history of the VETH expansion program, because the program had never before required revision of an operational category after contact had been established with the species being processed. Category 5 was still being defined. We were the only available source of information about what Category 5 looked like. Owen read the document twice, quietly, and then looked up with an expression I had not seen on him across the 3 weeks I had been working closely with him. It was the expression of a person who has been doing specific, bounded work, and has just understood that the work has produced something larger than its own boundaries. They are going back to review the analytical methodology applied in all 14 prior cases, he said, not to reverse the operational outcomes. Those cannot be reversed, but to formally document that the analytical process that produced those outcomes was flawed, and to place that documentation in the permanent operational record. Lena looked at him steadily. That matters. Yes, Owen said. It does. We were extracted from the station on the 14th day. Nick Ford and Bex Hayward stayed behind voluntarily, maintaining the dead man configuration on Anna's 7 points, until the formal suspension of the compliance protocol could be independently verified through signals analysis on the surface. The verification arrived 3 weeks later, confirmed by a transmission pattern that Lena's team authenticated as genuine administrative communication, rather than tactical mimicry. The shuttle sent for Nick and Bex was Australian. Someone with access to the extraction planning had specifically arranged for this, and I thought well of whoever that was. Nick ate a meat pie during the descent that a member of the extraction team had brought aboard as a deliberate gesture, and said it was the best meat pie he had ever eaten. Bex said that was a consequence of 3 weeks on compressed rations adjusting his baseline standards downward. Nick said his standards had not adjusted. Bex said they unquestionably had. This argument occupied the majority of the descent, and was later described by the 3 extraction team members present as the most comfortable re-entry experience they had had in their operational careers, which speaks well of what Nick and Bex had managed to remain across 3 weeks on their own, in a station that had been trying to process them. I watched their shuttle touch down on a screen in a facility outside Perth, surrounded by people who had been managing the groundside aspects of the negotiations since the team's extraction 2 weeks earlier. Then I went outside and sat on the steps of the facility in the early morning and watched the sky go through its colors over the western coast. There are thoughts you have when something that seemed likely to end badly has not ended as badly as it might have. Some of those thoughts are large and some are small, and the proportion between them does not distribute the way you would expect. I thought about the display room and the 14 groupings, and Owen spending 6 hours translating the labels into English, with the care he brought to everything that mattered. I thought about those 14 sets of objects and records now formally incorporated into a review process that acknowledged, in permanent VETH administrative documentation, that the analysis that had produced the situation they represented was flawed. I thought about Owen building 9% of an unknown language from 3 weeks of collected transmissions, and then using that 9% to produce an outcome that 14 prior species had not managed with every resource available to them. Then I thought about my mother's fruitcake in the freezer, and went inside to make a phone call. She answered on the second ring. "Davo," she said. "Hi, Mom," I said. "You sound tired." "I'm all right," I said. "Are you eating?" "Nick Ford kept everyone fed for 2 weeks, from a standard kit bag," I said. I genuinely cannot explain the logistics of it. She was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality she had always had. The quality of knowing that something significant had happened, and deciding whether to ask directly or to let it come in its own time. She had always let things come in their own time. It was one of the reasons that talking to her in difficult periods was more useful than talking to most people. "The fruitcake is still in the freezer," she said. "I know," I said. "I'm coming home." "Good," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." I sat on the facility steps for a while after the call ended, watching the sky lighten over the coast in the particular way it does in that part of Western Australia, a gradual shift through colors that I have looked for in other places and never found reproduced with the same quality. There are things that belong to specific places and that cannot be transplanted without losing the essence of what makes them worth having. The VETH had observed us for 212 years from above. They had recorded everything we said, and cataloged every pattern they could identify in what we did. They had been thorough in the way that a very well-resourced research program operating over a very long period can be thorough. They had applied their models to everything they collected, and confirmed every hypothesis they came in with. And they had still managed to miss the thing that was most directly relevant to understanding what they were dealing with. Not what we did under extreme pressure, not how we adapted to unfamiliar conditions, not the tactical qualities that had been visible in everything we did from the moment we came through that hatch. Those things had all contributed to the outcome, but they were not the thing that had actually changed the situation. The thing that had changed the situation was that we were curious. Genuinely, persistently, impractically curious about the universe we inhabited, including about the parts of it that had just attempted to process us into a managed category. Vaughan Marsh had spent 3 weeks building 9% of an alien language, not because he was told to, and not because it was strategically necessary, and not for any reason that could be reduced to operational function. He had done it because he encountered a communication system he did not understand, and understanding it mattered to him in a way that did not require justification. That was not a trained response. That was not a tactical behavior. That was simply what Owen was. And Gary Nolan standing in the display room and not speaking, because he understood that some moments require silence rather than commentary. Understanding this immediately and correctly without being told. And Pete Dawson noticing the Northwest Section's patrol routing anomaly through 2 days of patient observation that produced no immediate operational return until it suddenly produced a direct line to the authority above the fleet. And Nick Ford feeding 8 people across 14 days from a kit bag because that was a problem present in the situation, and he had the means to address it, and leaving it unaddressed was simply not something he was inclined to do. These were not things that appeared in any threat assessment. They were not things that a model built from the behavior of 14 other species would have predicted. They were things that were simply true about the specific people who had been in that specific situation, and they had been true in ways that mattered. The Veth had watched everything, and built a complete picture that was missing the part that determined the outcome. Maybe that was always going to be the problem with watching from a distance. You can see everything that is visible at that distance. What you cannot see is what the distance puts below the threshold of observation, the small, specific, true things about people that only become visible when you are close enough to share a corridor, or a card game, or a meal that someone produced from a kit bag through methods nobody was prepared to interrogate too closely. I drove to my mother's house the morning after Nick and Bex landed. It was a familiar drive, long enough to watch the city change character through the suburbs between the facility and the neighborhood I had grown up in, the geometry becoming less institutional and more organic, the streets becoming the kind of streets where someone always has something growing over their fence and nobody feels compelled to address it officially. My mother had the kettle going before I came through the door. She had cut 2 pieces of fruitcake and placed them on the table, with the precision she applied to small domestic arrangements, cups aligned with the table edge, plates at consistent distances, everything positioned as though the placement itself communicated care, which in practice it did. I sat down. She sat across from me. She poured tea without asking how I wanted it, because she had been making my tea for my entire life, and knew without asking. "Garden is looking reasonable," I said. "The tomatoes are better than last year," she said. "The eastern bed is still giving me problems. The neighbor's dog? Still finding ways through. I put an additional section on the fence in June. He went around it by August. Persistent animal," I said. "Extremely," she said. She picked up her tea and looked at me over the cup with the quality of looking she had always had, the kind that made you feel accurately, rather than partially seen. "Are you all right?" she said, not asking about the specifics. Not asking for the details she did not have clearance for and had never asked for. Asking about me, specifically, the person who had come through her door and was sitting at her table and looked slightly thinner than when he had left. "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. We sat in the morning light in her kitchen and talked about the tomatoes and the eastern bed and the neighbor's dog and what was growing well on the western side and what the situation was with the fence. Outside the window, the light was doing what it always did at that time of morning in that part of the city. Warm and slightly hazy, with the promise of the day becoming properly hot. and everything in the street was exactly as it always was. The ordinary world continuing in its ordinary way, completely unchanged by anything that had happened in the previous 2 weeks, in a station 1,400 kilometers above it. The Veth had watched us for 212 years. They had seen a great deal. They had not seen this kitchen. They had not seen the fruitcake, or the careful placement of the cups, or the quality of the silence between two people who do not need to say the significant things directly, because the significant things are already understood between them. They had not seen the morning light through that window, or what it does to a person sitting at a familiar table to experience something completely ordinary, after an extended period of nothing being ordinary. They had built their category system from everything they could observe at the distance they chose to observe from. And the distance they chose was the distance at which everything that mattered most about us was below the threshold of visibility. 9 months they had given us. 14 days we had needed. 8 people, a recovered scout vessel, 9% of an alien language, a dead man switch on 7 power distribution points, 1 card game in a captured communications hub, and the accumulated qualities of a team of people who had been shaped by enough difficult situations to have learned that the third option, the one that isn't the obvious one and isn't the second obvious one, is almost always available if you are willing to look for it with the right kind of patience. We had told them what we were. Now they were building a new category to put it in. And somewhere above us, in the documentation of a review process that had never been conducted before in the history of the Veth expansion program, 14 species who had not been given the conversation we had forced into existence were being formally acknowledged as the evidence of a flawed methodology, rather than simply the products of a successful one. That was not everything. But in my experience, starting from something is always how you get to more. I ate the fruitcake. My mother refilled my tea without being asked. Outside, the neighbor's dog was, by the sounds of it, testing the fence situation again, persistent, in exactly the way Pete Dawson had noted, and with exactly the kind of patient consistency that, if applied in the right direction by the right kind of people, turns out to be one of the most significant forces in the known universe. The kettle was still warm, the morning was still doing its ordinary thing, and somewhere above the suburb and the city and the coast and the continent, the sky was the same sky it had always been, specific to this place and this time of morning, belonging to no one, and available to anyone who took the time to look at it. We were still here. And under the circumstances, still being here was a result I was prepared to consider satisfactory. The fleet's reclassification of Earth did not stay quiet for long. Within 6 hours of our broadcast going through the Veth uplink, Lena intercepted transmissions on frequencies that Owen identified as belonging to neither the Veth fleet nor any of the 6 surface monitoring vessels. Someone else was listening. Someone else had been listening to the Veth communication channels for long enough to know what frequency to tune to when the traffic suddenly changed character. Owen spent 40 minutes on the new signals before he could say anything definitive. When he could, he gathered us in the hub and said it plainly. There are at least 3 separate non-Veth receivers tracking the fleet communication traffic. 2 of them appear to be automated relay systems, recording and forwarding. One of them is active. It has been transmitting responses to an origin point I cannot yet locate, but the transmission pattern is consistent with a manned observation post, rather than an automated system. Someone else is watching the Veth watch us, Gary said. Yes, Owen said, and from the volume of traffic they are generating in response to our broadcast, whatever they are watching has been significantly more interesting in the past 6 hours than it was before. The idea that other species in the region of space the Veth operated in might be observing Veth expansion operations was something the intelligence briefings before launch had flagged as possible but unconfirmed. The Veth were not the only advanced civilization in their operational area. They were simply the most aggressive and the most organized about applying that aggression. Other species had been dealing with the consequences of Veth expansion for longer than Earth had been under observation. Some of them had been through the process themselves and come out the other side, as what the Veth called administered populations. Others had apparently remained outside the Veth operational scope, either because they were too distant, or because something about their profile had placed them outside the risk threshold the Veth applied when selecting targets. What none of them had done, in the time they had been watching Veth expansion operations, was observe an operation stall. Owen continued to track the external signals throughout the standoff period, and the picture he built over those 11 days was remarkable, in ways that went well beyond the immediate situation in the station. The 3 receivers he had initially identified became 6 as more systems tuned in. The content of the transmissions he could partially decode suggested a level of attention among outside observers that had not been directed at a Veth expansion operation in a very long time. On the 5th day of the standoff, one of the external receivers did something none of the others had done. It transmitted directly at the station, on a frequency that Lena identified and flagged within seconds, using an encoding that was not Veth and that Owen had never encountered before. It took him 4 hours to extract anything intelligible from it. What he extracted was 6 words, rendered in English with the careful qualification that he was working from a single transmission, using an encoding he was encountering for the first time, and that his confidence in the translation was roughly 60%. The 6 words were, "We have been watching you fight." Owen read them aloud to the team. The hub was quiet for a moment. "Fight is an interesting word choice," Pete said from the back. "It is," Owen said. "The encoding has a concept that maps approximately to fight, in the sense of refusing to stop, not combat specifically, something more like sustained resistance in the face of a force that expects capitulation." "Who are they?" I asked. "I don't know yet," Owen said. "The transmission origin is consistent with a vessel in the outer orbital range above the planet, which means they are close enough to have been observing this station directly, rather than through relay. They have been here long enough to have watched everything since we boarded." "Send something back," I said. Owen looked at me. "I have 6 words of their encoding, and 60% confidence in my translation." "Then send something in 6 words or fewer," I said, "and be 60% confident about it." Owen worked for 20 minutes. Then he sent a transmission on the same frequency, using the encoding elements he had extracted, that he rendered in English as approximately, "We have not finished yet." The response came back in 43 minutes. Owen worked on it for 2 hours, cross-referencing the new material against his initial extraction, and refining his understanding of the encoding structure. When he was done, he looked up. "Their name for themselves," he said carefully, "renders into English as something close to the Sarathi. The transmission says, 'We fought the Veth for 40 years. 8 of you have done more in one night than we managed in 4 decades of formal resistance. We are watching. We are recording. Whatever happens next, what you have done here will not be lost.'" The hub was very quiet. Nick Ford closed his notebook. Lena put down the equipment she had been adjusting and sat still for a moment. Vic, who had been at the secondary access point for the previous 3 hours in his particular quality of complete readiness, lowered his arms and stood normally, which from Vic was a significant relaxation. Gary looked at the floor, and then at the ceiling, and then at me, and the expression on his face was one I recognized from one previous situation in 12 years of knowing him. A situation in the Solomons that I will not describe because it does not need describing. And that expression meant he was feeling something he was not going to name out loud, but that he was not going to pretend was not present either. Pete said, from the back of the hub where he had been standing for the past hour, 40 years. "That is what it says," Owen confirmed. 40 years, Pete said again. Not disbelieving it, processing it. Making room for what 40 years of sustained resistance against a force that had processed 14 civilizations meant for the people who had been sustaining it. "What do we send back?" Lena asked. I thought about it. "Tell them we are still here," I said, "and that we intend to be here when this is finished." Owen composed the transmission and sent it. The Sarathi response came back in less than 10 minutes this time, which Owen said was consistent with a vessel close enough that the signal travel time was minimal, which meant they were closer than the outer orbital range he had initially estimated. They were very close. They had positioned themselves close enough to observe the station directly, which carried its own kind of risk, given what the Veth would do with the knowledge that someone was in their operational space monitoring their activity. The Sarathi response said, as Owen translated it across the following 90 minutes, that they had been in this region for 6 of the 40 years they had been resisting, and that in 6 years of observation, they had seen nothing like what they were currently watching, and that the transmission we had sent through the Veth fleet uplink had already reached the wider network of species that had been quietly tracking Veth expansion operations. and that 3 of those species had made contact with Earth's surface directly through diplomatic channels that bypassed the Veth monitoring vessels entirely. 3 species contacting Earth directly, bypassing the Veth. I called Grimes on the secure channel we had established through Gary's communications route back to the scout vessel. He picked up on the second signal, which meant he had been close to the receiver. "Colonel," I said, "are you aware of contact from external parties?" A pause. "We are managing several new diplomatic channels that opened in the past 48 hours, Grimes said. "The situation on the ground is developing significantly." "The Sarathi," I said. Another pause, slightly longer. "You know about them." "Owen has been in contact with one of their observation vessels for the past day," I said. "They have 40 years of experience with the Veth expansion program. They want to talk." "We know," Grimes said. "They have already made contact with the foreign affairs people through a channel that nobody anticipated, and that nobody on our side has been able to fully explain yet. The conversation is ongoing." He paused again. "Davo, what you sent through the Veth uplink, the footage, the display room documentation, the translation work, it has not stayed within the Veth fleet." "I know," I said. "It has reached every species in the region that has been monitoring Veth operations," Grimes said. "There are currently 11 separate diplomatic contacts with Earth, from parties that have not previously made themselves known to us. 11, in 48 hours. I sat with that number for a moment. 11 species. 11 civilizations that had been aware of Earth, watching Veth expansion operations from a careful distance, making no contact because contact with a species under active Veth processing was either pointless or dangerous, and who had in the past 48 hours decided that the situation had changed enough to be worth the risk of saying something. "How are they taking it?" I asked. "The species that have been watching." Grimes was quiet for a moment, in the way that means someone is choosing how to phrase something accurately. "The general response," he said carefully, "is something between disbelief and something I do not have a precise word for. The Sarathi representative apparently said to our foreign affairs contact that they had spent 6 years in this region watching Veth operations and had concluded that the process was effectively unstoppable, and that the only rational position for any species with the knowledge of what the Veth were doing was to make themselves invisible and hope the operational parameters changed before they became a target. And then 8 people from a planet that had been given 9 months to comply boarded the central processing station and made the parameters change in 14 days. "We have not finished yet," I said. "No," Grimes said. "But something has already changed that I do not think is going to change back. The 11 species that have made contact. They have been watching the Veth operate in this region for between 12 and 200 years. Not one of them has made a direct move against the Veth in that entire period. They have been waiting, and now 3 of them have contacted us, and one of them has positioned an observation vessel close enough to your station to be reading your communications in near real time, and several others have made direct contact with our government. What are they waiting for?" I asked. "For the conversation you are having up there to produce a result," Grimes said. "Whatever comes out of the negotiation with the authority representative is going to be read very carefully by a lot of parties who have been waiting a long time to see if the Veth expansion process had any flexibility in it at all." I looked around the hub. Owen at his translation equipment, Bex at the secondary access point, Vic in his particular quality of steady readiness. Through the open comms I could hear Lena working on her signals analysis in the outer section, the faint sounds of her adjusting frequencies, and the quiet breath she made when she found something worth examining. 8 people, 14 days, 11 new diplomatic contacts, 1 40-year resistance operation that had apparently found renewed purpose, and a Veth Authority representative currently in transit, who had been sent not to authorize an outcome but to understand something. "Colonel," I said. "Yes. We are going to need Owen for the next phase more than anyone else," I said. "His translation work is the foundation of everything that happens in the next conversation. If there is any additional resource you can put towards supporting his analysis remotely, from the surface, through the communications channel Gary established, I want it." "Done," Grimes said without hesitation. "Who do you need?" "Anyone with a background in structural linguistics, non-human communication systems, or chemical signal analysis," I said. "Owen will brief them directly." I'll have people in contact within the hour, Grimes said. One more thing, I said. The Sarathi. When the authority representative arrives and the formal talks begin, I want the Sarathi observation vessel to know what is being discussed. Not in real time, but afterward. I want them to have a record. Grimes was quiet for a moment. That is outside standard operational parameters. Yes, I said. Most of what we are doing is outside standard operational parameters. That has been the operational parameter since we launched. A pause. I'll flag it with the foreign affairs people, he said. No promises. Understood, I said. He had barely ended the transmission before Lena came on the team channel. Devo, the fleet traffic has changed again. Volume is up 40% in the past 20 minutes. Owen needs to hear this. Owen was already moving toward his equipment. What the fleet traffic contained, when Owen had processed enough of it to be confident in the picture, was evidence of a significant internal conversation among the fleet commanders about the authority representative's transit to the station. The conversation was not about the representative's instructions or their anticipated approach. It was about precedent. Several fleet commanders were apparently raising, formally and for the record, the question of what it meant operationally that an authority representative was being sent to a contact site for purposes of direct exchange rather than operational authorization. This had not happened before. The authority operated above the fleet. The authority issued authorizations and reviewed outcomes. It did not send representatives to contact sites to have conversations with the species being processed. The fact that it was doing so now was, for the fleet commanders involved in the discussion, a significant departure from every operational precedent they had on record. Owen translated the key passages and read them to us. The one that stayed with me longest was from what appeared to be one of the senior fleet commanders, a transmission that Owen translated as, "The Earth contact has produced a situation the authority has chosen to engage with directly, rather than resolve through standard channels. This is the first time in the program's history that this level of engagement has been initiated. Whatever the outcome of the representative's transit, the operational record of this contact will be studied for a long time." Studied, Beck said. That is the word, Owen said. By who? Nick asked. By whoever comes after, Pete said quietly. He was right. Whatever the outcome of the conversation with the authority representative, the record of this contact was going to be the most unusual document in the history of the VETH expansion program. An operation that had proceeded correctly 14 consecutive times had stalled at the 15th. The species at the 15th contact had boarded the processing station, held it for 2 weeks, initiated direct communication with the fleet, and then sent a proposal to the authority above the fleet that the authority had responded to by sending a direct representative for the first time in the program's history. That record was going to be read. By the VETH, certainly. During the review process the representative had described. But also, Owen now confirmed from the external signals, by the 11 species that had made diplomatic contact with Earth, and the others that were watching, but had not yet spoken. The broadcast through the VETH uplink had made our presence here and our actions here visible to a very wide audience. What happened next was going to be observed by everyone who had been watching the VETH operate in this part of space, and wondering whether the operation had any flexibility in it at all. That was the weight of it, not what it meant for Earth, which was already significant. What it meant for all the species that had been watching from a careful distance, waiting for a sign that the parameters could change. I did not share this specific framing with the team. They did not need it. They were already doing the work with everything they had, for the reasons that had brought them here, and adding the weight of a galactic audience to the reasons they were already working from would have been both unnecessary and unwelcome. You do not do better work when you are thinking about who is watching. You do better work when you are thinking about what needs doing. But I thought about it privately, standing near the secondary access point while Owen worked, and Bex cataloged, and Lena tracked, and the others held their positions in the outer sections. I thought about 40 years of the Sarathi watching an operation, and concluding it was unstoppable. I thought about 11 species that had been aware of Earth and had said nothing, because saying something to a species under active VETH processing was either futile or dangerous. I thought about what it meant that all of those calculations had changed in 14 days. 8 people. The math of it was unreasonable by any standard measure. 8 people in a vessel the size of a transport truck, with a secondary control system built from improvised materials, and 9% of an alien language, and a demolition specialist who had found something interesting in the engine section, against a fleet of ships and a processing station that had successfully administered the same operation 14 consecutive times. The math was unreasonable. The outcome was apparently happening anyway. I had a conversation with my brother in Brisbane on the third day of the standoff, using the secure channel through Gary's communications relay. My brother's name was Cal, and he was a civil engineer who had spent the past decade building bridges in Queensland, and he had a very direct approach to complex problems that had always been both useful and occasionally exasperating, depending on the complexity of the problem and how much of it could actually be simplified without losing something essential. He said, "The news down here is absolutely wild, Davo. They are saying there are 11 species that have contacted the government, 11, from space, and that the Veth fleet has stopped moving. Is any of that accurate?" "Some of it," I said. "Which parts?" "The parts about the fleet and the contacts," I said. A pause. "Are you in the middle of it?" "I cannot say," I said, which was as much confirmation as I was permitted to give. Cal was quiet for a moment, with the quality of quiet that means he is running calculations. Then he said, "Is it going all right?" "So far," I said. "Right," he said. "Good. Mum's been baking since Tuesday. She's made 3 cakes and a tray of slices. I don't know who she thinks she's feeding. She won't say why she's doing it." "She knows," I said. "Knows what?" "That it's going to be all right," I said. "She always knows before the news does." Cal made a sound that was between a laugh and an acknowledgement. "She did the same thing when you were in the Solomons. Baked for 3 days and then you called and said everything was fine. She has a reliable system," I said. "She does," Cal said. "Come home soon." "Yeah?" "Working on it," I said. I ended the call and went back to work. The conversation had done what those conversations always do, which is to remind you of the thing you are working toward without making the work heavier to carry. It is easier to hold something when you know where you are taking it. On the 7th day of the standoff, something unexpected happened in the outer sections of the station. Pete found it. Pete found most of the unexpected things that happened in spaces he was moving through, because Pete moved through spaces at a speed and with a quality of attention that gave him access to details that people moving faster would miss. He called it in without urgency, which was how Pete called in everything, including things that turned out to be significant. "There is a Veth in the corridor junction at Section 7, he said. "It has been there for approximately 40 minutes. It is not doing anything. It is not part of a patrol. It is not approaching any operational area. It is simply standing in the junction." "Is it transmitting?" Lena asked. "Not on any frequency I am tracking," Lena said after a check. "No outgoing signals from that position." "Owen," I said. "Yes," Owen said. He had heard the exchange. "Is there any behavioral pattern in the Veth documentation that corresponds to a single individual standing in a location without operational purpose?" Owen thought for a moment. His thinking was visible on his face in a specific way, a slight narrowing of focus that meant he was pulling from the accumulated translation work and cross-referencing it against what he knew of Veth behavioral patterns. "The closest pattern I can identify from the documentation is what appears in Veth operational records as observation without intervention. It occurs in contexts where a Veth individual has encountered something that falls outside their operational mandate and has not yet received updated mandate guidance. They hold position and observe." "It is watching Pete," I said. "That would be consistent," Owen said. "What is it seeing?" Owen was quiet for a moment. "Pete moving through Section 7, in the way that Pete moves through Section 7, he said. Pete was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most unusual things the Veth had encountered since we boarded. Not because of anything dramatic. Because of the quality of his presence in a space, the way he moved through it, the way he looked at it. Pete moved through unfamiliar environments with the patient attention of someone who has decided that understanding the space he is in is more important than getting through it quickly, and this was not a quality the Veth operational documentation appeared to have a category for. They had categories for approach patterns, for threat behaviors, for compliance indicators. They did not appear to have a category for a person who was simply moving through a corridor and looking at everything in it, with genuine interest. The Veth in the junction stood there for 3 more hours. Then it turned and walked away, back toward the outer sections where the Veth personnel had been maintaining their operations. Owen logged it in his translation notes with a brief comment that I read over his shoulder, and that read, "Individual appeared to be engaged in the same activity Pete was engaged in. Mutual observation without intervention, no precedent in documentation." That seemed right. On the 9th day, the authorities' response came through the Northwest link, and on the 11th day, the representative arrived, and the conversation that followed I have described already in its major outlines. What I have not described is what the conversation felt like from the inside of it, because that is the kind of thing that is harder to document than outcomes, and that gets lost if you do not make the effort to record it while it is still fresh. It felt like an opening, not a resolution, not a victory in any sense that would look like victory from the outside. It felt like two parties that had been pointed toward each other from a fixed and assumed distance, discovering that the distance was not fixed, and that moving closer produced different information than either party had access to from where they had been standing. The representative asked questions that the briefing materials for 14 prior operations apparently had not contained. It asked about the display room and what we had felt when we saw it, not what we had concluded from it operationally, what we had felt. Owen translated this question with a particular care and delivered it to me with the quiet note that this question type did not appear in any Veth communication pattern he had previously analyzed, which meant it was new, which meant the representative had generated it specifically for this exchange, which meant something about this exchange was producing new behavior in the party that had arrived with the weight of 212 years of certainty behind it. I answered honestly. I said that we had felt that the 14 species in that room deserved to be remembered by someone who was still in a position to remember them in a way that made a difference, that the objects in those groupings were not trophies. They were evidence of minds that had existed and thought and made things. That evidence deserved to be in the hands of people who could do something with it, not locked in a collection maintained by the people who had ended those minds' independence. The representative was quiet for a long time after Owen delivered this, long enough that Owen began quietly checking his translation to make sure it had been correctly rendered. It had been. The silence was not a product of miscommunication. It was the silence of someone who had received information they were genuinely processing. When the representative spoke again, it said something that took Owen nearly 10 minutes to fully translate, working carefully through the chemical vibrational composite and checking each concept against his accumulated reference materials. When he had it, he looked up and read it slowly. "The objects in the collection are documentation of contact," the representative said, in Owen's rendering. "They have not previously been understood as evidence of minds in the sense you have described. They are operational records of successful processing. To treat them as evidence of minds that existed and were ended is a framing we have not applied to them. I do not know yet what applying that framing will produce, but I will take it back, to the authority, to the review process, to the permanent operational record that was being built from this contact, the record that Owen had confirmed would be studied for a long time by a lot of parties who needed to understand what had happened here and why." "Thank you," I said. "You continue to use that phrase," the representative said. "It is what you say when someone has given you something," I said. The representative processed this through Owen's translation. Then it said, "What have I given you?" "The possibility that the framing can change," I said. "That is not a small thing." The representative was quiet for 7 seconds. "No," it said, "I do not think it is." The talks concluded on the morning of the 4th day. The representative departed. The Northwest link carried the formal document suspending compliance deadlines. The fleet held position for another 2 days and then, over a period of 18 hours, began a staged withdrawal to a distance beyond Earth's orbital range. The 6 surface monitoring vessels retracted into their landing positions and sealed. The main Veth ship above the equator, the one the size of Tasmania, moved outward to a position that the surface tracking systems registered as non-threatening. Not gone, not committed to anything permanent, but moved. And in the international news cycle that had been running continuously for 11 days since the fleet reclassification broadcast, the headline that ran in more languages than any headline since the initial Veth transmission was simple, and in most versions 4 words. The fleet has moved. Not the fleet has left. The fleet has moved. The distinction mattered. But moving was the beginning of leaving, if the conversations that followed produced the right results. And the conversations had been started, and they were being conducted now by people who had more information, and more context, and more counterparties willing to participate than anyone on Earth had had 14 days ago. That was the outcome. Not a complete resolution, not a clean ending, an opening, as I said, a shift in the parameters of what was possible, produced by 8 people who had decided that the third option was always available, and had been willing to look for it with the right kind of patience, for 14 consecutive days, while an alien fleet sat above the planet, and the world watched from below. The world had opinions about what had happened. Most of them took the form that news coverage always takes, which is to simplify the complicated thing into a shape that fits the time available for it. The simplified version was that a small military team had boarded the alien station and forced the aliens to reconsider. That was accurate in the way that simplified versions of complicated things are accurate, which is to say it contained the major facts but missed the texture of them. What was harder to convey in simplified form was Owen working through 90 hours of continuous analysis across 3 weeks to build the tool that made the conversation possible, or Lena's external signal detection identifying the Sarathi observation vessel 40 minutes before anyone else would have known to look for it, or Pete standing in a corridor for 2 days, building his model of the space, finding the northwest section's routing anomaly by sheer patient attention, or Anna's 40-second assessment of the northwest door, producing access to the link that made it possible to send the proposal directly to the authority, rather than going through the fleet. Or Bex's 2-second spatial assessment of the hub before we moved through the hatch that made those 8 minutes work correctly. Or Nick Ford feeding 8 people for 14 days from a standard kit bag through a logistical process that I have still not fully explained to myself. Or Gary Nolan standing in the display room without speaking, because he understood that some things require silence, and that silence is a form of respect, and that respect for the 14 species in those groupings was the foundation of every argument we made afterward about why the framing needed to change. 8 people, each of them doing the specific thing they were best at, in the conditions available, without waiting for better conditions. That is the honest account of it. The negotiations that followed our extraction from the station extended across the better part of 2 years. They involved people at levels of government I did not have access to, and through communication channels that Owen helped establish, and that Lena helped make secure. They produced, at the end of those 2 years, something that had never existed before in the operational history of the VETH expansion program, a formal mutual exchange framework, agreed by both parties, that established direct communication channels between Earth and the VETH Authority, suspended the expansion program's application to Earth indefinitely pending review, and created a joint documentation process for the 14 prior cases that would be conducted with input from every party that could be reached, including the administered populations, where those populations retained any form of organized communication. That last part was Owen's contribution, submitted as a formal proposal through the Joint Documentation Working Group that he was appointed to lead. The VETH had initially proposed that the review of the 14 prior cases be conducted internally. Owen had submitted a 15-page argument for why that was the wrong approach, and the VETH Working Group had spent 3 weeks reviewing it, and had then agreed with it. Owen told me about this on a phone call in which his voice had the particular quality of someone who is very pleased about something and is choosing not to make a large production of it. They agreed with all 15 pages? I asked. The substance of all 15, he said. There were some points of language that required revision. The final version was 17 pages. Good work, Owen, I said. It is a starting point, he said. The working group has a lot of material to cover. It is going to take some time. We have time now, I said. Yes, he said. We do. Lena was promoted twice in the 2 years following the mission. She did not particularly want the promotions, but she accepted them because the alternative was explaining to multiple senior officers why she did not want them, and that explanation would have taken longer than the additional responsibilities. She continued to do the work that she had always done, which was to listen to frequencies that other people did not know to listen to, and find in the things she heard the patterns that changed how everyone understood the situation. She found 3 more Sarathi observation vessels in the months after our return, all of them positioned around Earth at distances consistent with long-term monitoring, and she established a direct communication channel with each of them that eventually fed into the formal diplomatic framework that opened between Earth and the Sarathi people 18 months later. The Sarathi had been resisting the Veth for 40 years. When the Earth-Veth Mutual Exchange Framework was formally signed, the Sarathi submitted a diplomatic request to be included in the joint documentation process as a third-party observer. The request was granted after 6 weeks of negotiation. Owen told me that the Sarathi representative at the first joint session had sat very still for the first 20 minutes without speaking, watching the Veth and Earth representatives engage in direct exchange around a common table, and that afterward the Sarathi representative had said to Owen privately, in the partial encoding Owen had developed for communication with their observation vessels, that they had been watching the Veth operate for 40 years, and had come to believe that direct engagement was not possible, and that they were going to need some time to revise that belief. "What did you say?" I asked Owen. "I told them we had the time," he said. Anna Cole published 2 papers in the 14 months following the mission, both of them in technical journals with restricted distribution, both of them concerned with aspects of the Veth power system that she was permitted to write about, given that the information had been formally shared under the mutual exchange framework. The papers produced significant attention in the engineering and physics communities, not because of what they contained specifically, but because of what they implied about the gap between what humanity currently understood about energy systems and what was apparently possible given the right theoretical framework. Anna described this gap, in a presentation she gave at a conference I was not permitted to attend, as a starting point, rather than a discouraging distance. Bex Hayward did not return to standard regimental duties after the mission. She spent 14 months attached to the Joint Documentation Working Group as a structural analyst, applying to the records of the 14 prior cases the same systematic attention she had applied to the interior of the Veth station. Her work identified 12 instances in the documentation of the prior 14 cases where the Veth analytical methodology had produced a result that their own internal records showed was inconsistent with direct observational data, but that had been categorized as an anomaly and set aside rather than incorporated into the model. These 12 instances became the foundation of Owen's formal argument for why the review of the prior cases needed to be conducted with external participation, rather than internally. Nick Ford went back to standard duties 3 weeks after the mission was formally concluded. He was the same person after as before, which sounds like it should be unremarkable, but which in practice is one of the harder things to achieve after 14 days of conditions that tended to change people in ways they did not always choose and could not always anticipate. He produced a comprehensive after-action report on the logistical aspects of the operation that was detailed to a degree that several senior officers described as excessive and that I described as exactly sufficient, and then he went back to doing the work he had always done, which was to ensure that the people he was operating with had what they needed to do their work correctly. Vic Hale spent the months after the mission attached to a training program that was developing what the documentation called Enhanced Cross-Environment Operational Protocols, which was the official language for teaching people to work effectively in spaces that had not been designed for them. He was the right choice for this role. He was the right choice for most roles that required a person who could assess an unfamiliar environment in very little time and move through it with a precision that made the environment-specific challenges irrelevant to the outcome. Gary Nolan and I had a conversation about the mission over drinks in Perth about 6 months after we returned. Gary had the quality he always had in retrospective conversations, which was to be simultaneously accurate about what had happened and quietly amused by all of it. The amusement being not at the events themselves, but at the gap between the scale of what had happened and the completely ordinary character of the people it had happened to. "The thing I keep thinking about," Gary said, "is the carpet cleaning advertisement." "Yes," I said. "After everything they said, 9 months, 14 species, surface sterilization, and then immediately, have your carpets never looked cleaner." "It was a jarring transition," I said. "It was the most jarring transition in the history of broadcast media," Gary said. "And I keep thinking about it, because that is what it was like for us, the whole time. The thing they said was as large as anything that has ever been said to any species. and our response was to eat a cold meat pie and start thinking about the problem. It was a reasonable response, I said. It was a very Australian response, Gary said, which is probably what they did not expect. It is definitely what they did not expect, I said. Owen has the Category 5 documentation. They used the phrase, does not match any known pattern, approximately 11 times in the first 3 days. 11 times, Gary said. He was pleased by this in the particular way that Gary was pleased by things, which was without demonstration, but with a quality of satisfaction that was visible if you knew what you were looking at. 11, I said. Gary picked up his glass. To the third option, he said. The third option, I said. We drank. Outside the window of the bar, the Perth evening was doing what Perth evenings do, which is to be warmer than you expect and lighter than you remember, the sky holding the last of the color for longer than seems strictly necessary before finally letting it go. We were still here. The planet was still here. The conversations that needed to happen were happening, in conference rooms and on communication channels, and in joint documentation working groups, and in the informal exchanges that take place outside formal sessions, when representatives from two very different kinds of minds spend enough time working on a common problem, that the work itself becomes a kind of communication that supplements everything else. It was not finished. It was probably never going to be finished in the sense of arriving at a point where nothing remained to be done. But it was started. And starting from something, as I have said before, is always how you get to more. My mother's garden was doing well that year. The tomatoes on the western side were good, and the eastern bed had been somewhat resolved through a fence modification that had finally outpaced the neighbor's dog, at least for now. She had started growing something new along the southern border that she said a friend had recommended, and that was doing better than expected, though she could not yet say why. I sat with her in the garden on a Saturday afternoon, in what turned out to be a very warm autumn, and we drank tea, and did not talk about anything that had happened in the past year in any specific way, and that was exactly the right conversation to be having. Above us, the sky was the color it always was at that time of day, in that season, in that part of the world, moving toward the particular warm tone that precedes the cooler evening air, familiar and specific, and impossible to fully describe to someone who had not seen it from exactly this spot, at exactly this time of year. The Veth had watched us for 212 years. They had seen everything they knew to look for. They had not seen this. And now they were learning to look for the things they had not known to look for, in a joint process that was going to take a long time, and that was going to produce a record that would be read by a lot of parties who had been waiting a long time to see if the parameters could change. They could. They had. 8 people, 14 days, the third option. And a fruit cake in the freezer, and a neighbor's dog that was persistent but not insurmountable, and the sky above the garden going warm and particular, in the way that it always did at this time of year, in this place, belonging to no category system anyone had ever devised and available, always, to anyone who took the time to look up.